In this critical Let's Play, I will analyze the game Transistor by Supergiant Games. To begin, I will be discussing how Transistor is an exemplary model of the sci-fi action RPG genre, and why it fits not only on the PC platform, but on consoles as well. Next, we'll explore the design qualities of Transistor using course concepts from both the readings and lectures. Finally, we'll analyze Supergiant Games' underlying business model and conditions that led to the success of Transistor. In order to prove why Transistor fits its genre so well, we will break it up into separate and distinct parts for analysis. To start, how does Transistor earn the sci-fi part of its sci-fi action RPG genre? Well, Transistor is set almost entirely in the futuristic city of Cloudbank. Cloudbank is a city teeming with technology, from Red Sword, dubbed the Transistor, to her robotic foes called the Process. The Transistor holds the ability to absorb the consciousness of fallen friends and enemies, granting Red new powers each time. Outside of the game universe, many aspects of the game are related to the computer science field. For example, combat abilities are named using function notation. For example, the abilities Turn, Help, and Breach all have closed brackets following their names. The sword is even named after a transistor, which gives the game a more science fiction feel. Action RPG is the second part of Transistor's genre. While some people would think that action and RPG are not related, action RPG is in fact a subgenre of RPG. Action RPGs differ with RPGs when it comes to combat. Normal RPGs like Pokemon typically feature turn-based combat in which each side must wait for the other's move before performing their own. Action RPGs, on the other hand, usually have real-time combat where both sides can move and attack whenever they want. Transistor is unique in this accord because it features both turn-based combat with the turn function and real-time combat, but is ultimately classified as an action RPG because the vast majority of combat is in real time. But what makes Transistor an RPG at all? Well, RPGs offer the player an opportunity to immerse themselves in the player character's situation and world. In Transistor, the player follows Red, a former singer who has lost her voice in an assassination attempt as she treks across Cloudbank in order to find those who ordered the hit. The player from the very beginning becomes immersed in Red's problems and joins her on the journey to resolve them. Transistor can be played on the majority of platforms. While Transistor is available on all operating systems, it is interestingly only available on PS4 console-wise. This is not because of hardware issues, as Transistor is a game which can fluidly be played on all control interfaces, from controller to keyboard. Rather, this was a business decision, as Supergiant Games partnered with Sony to bring Transistor to the PlayStation 4 and not Xbox One. To start off the second section of our analysis, we will break Transistor up into sections in order to organize our thoughts. These sections will be gameplay, game design, and the player. One of the first concepts the player experiences in Transistor is the magic circle. Simply put, the magic circle is the space within which the game takes place. This space is separate from reality and even has its own time and space. Transistor springboards the player into the magic circle by removing the menu screens most games have. Instead, Transistor immediately places the player into the game world. From there, the game quickly introduces you to its operational rules. Things such as moving and attacking are some of the numerous things players need to do to play the game. Foundational rules are also observed fairly early on as well, as both your health meter and turn meter are used to keep track of the foundational game state. The only other type of rules that are featured in Transistor are advisory rules, but many of them need to be looked up as they are not really rules from a game mechanic standpoint, but from a rule of strategy point of view. While on the subject of game mechanics, Transistor uses a type of space that was seen in older games, but has soon died out. The game takes an isometric point of view, which is somewhat akin to staring at a game board in real life. What's different from a board game, however, is Transistor space is almost entirely continuous, as you can walk everywhere, outside of spots that are obviously not meant to be traversed like walls. The game is also deceptively a two-dimensional game. There is a Z-axis, or third dimension, aesthetically, but it serves no purpose gameplay-wise, as enemies who float off the ground are susceptible to the same attacks as those who are on the ground. One may argue Transistor has a degree of discontinuity, however, as many locations are bound together and must be passed into through a cutscene rather than simply walking. While walking between these areas, the player is bound to run into some of the many objects the game has. Because objects can be considered the nouns of a game, Transistor, and many other games, naturally has a lot. To save time, we'll go over the most prominent ones. Transistor's protagonist, Red, has a slew of attributes, from static attributes, like her appearance and weapon, to dynamic ones, such as her movement mode and her abilities. Red's movement attribute has 3 states. Free movement, where she moves around the battlefield in real time. The turn function, where she stops time in order to plan out her abilities. And finally, crowd control, or her ability to move is being hindered by an enemy. Her abilities or functions also have their own states, as upon death, Red can lose one of her abilities, in addition to being able to customize them. The process are the main antagonists in Transistor, and like Red, their appearance is a static attribute, as they consistently go for the same color scheme among their minions. For their dynamic attributes and states, they have free movement, the same as Red, and death, which they also share with Red. One difference, however, is that the process has a down state, wherein they respawn unless they are picked up by Red. In order to combat the process, the player must utilize a host of actions in order to defeat them. One such way is by utilizing operative actions, or simply the base actions a player can take. For example, these include using abilities and walking around the battlefield. Resultant actions are actions that are meaningful in the larger picture of the game. While resultant actions typically use operative actions, they aren't as obvious in Transistor. Resultant actions are the most commonly found when the player is positioning on the battlefield. While you could simply hit the closest target, if you take the time to position correctly, you could affect the outcome of the battle in a greater way. This could be lining up your shot in order to hit multiple enemies, hitting high-value targets like healers, or even moving to prevent the enemy's respawns. Of course, being able to effectively utilize resultant actions requires a degree of skill from the player. Physically, the player must be able to quickly recognize the attack the enemy is performing and act accordingly, whether it is to dodge or respond with an attack of their own. Mentally, players need to know how to properly observe the battlefield in order to come up with good strategy. While you could simply turn off your brain and mindlessly run it into enemies, it is far more efficient time-wise to simply make a plan of attack. With the use of real skills and virtual combat skills that Red possesses, that is, skills that don't exist in real life, the player is able to progress fairly easily throughout the game. Transistor features very little to no chance in the main game. It was likely designed in such a way in order to keep the experience consistent for players, as the main focus of the game is in its story. That being said, should the player beat the game and then restart it via New Game Plus, a new mode that allows you to replay the game with all your skills and levels carried over from the previous game, all the battles are procedurally generated, meaning each battle will be filled with random enemies. Setting aside gameplay for the time being, we can begin to look at the way the game was designed. Transistor can be identified as a ludus game, that is to say, being structured and controlled with very specific rules. While the player is free to utilize these rules in whichever way they wish, they are still rules regardless. To go further, Transistor falls within the mimicry category when deciphering its mode of play. This is because Transistor is a role-playing game filled with many fantasy elements. It lacks competition, ruling out Aegon, lacks chance, ruling out Aelia, but does have Ilinx, or disruption of perception. This is because some enemies have the ability to distort your vision in the game. Of the 4 types of interactivity, Transistor features them all. Cognitively, the player is able to interact with the system in a psychological, emotional, and intellectual way. The player becomes invested in Red's tragic story and will do anything to help her find her way. Explicitly, the player is able to choose many aspects of the game, from determining how to approach fights to customizing your functions to fit your playstyle. The player is given an objective, but is not given a specific way to complete it also. Functionally, the player is using whatever interface they need to control Red. In our case, we use the mouse and keyboard to interact with the system, but a controller can be used as well. Beyond the object, interactivity is also present due to the rise of the internet. While in the past this may have been difficult, websites like Reddit allow Transistor to have a fairly healthy gaming community based around it, allowing for discussions, strategies, and theories to be shared. Maintaining a proper flow state can be difficult for developers, as they must balance game difficulty and skill required of the player. In general, how challenging the game is should be proportional to how much skill is required from the player. If the game becomes too difficult, the player will be frustrated, but if it is too easy, the player will be bored. The most effective way to maintain a good flow state is by properly balancing the game. A game should never be too simple or complex. Transistor is designed with emergent complexity in mind. While the game starts out fairly easy, the difficulty ramps up along with the player, keeping the player challenged but not frustrated. The developers allowed complexity to grow organically, never throwing the player into a new set of rules or twisting the old ones. As an analogy, the developers never take away your tools, they just ask you to build more complex buildings. To touch on Transistor's story without many spoilers, we will look at it through the lens of a ludologist. that is, focusing more on mechanics and structure of the story rather than the actual story itself. Structurally, Transistor was designed linearly, as the developers had a clear and thoughtful story in mind when producing the game. The narrative is embedded, meaning that it is up to the player to follow the story rather than create it emergently. Conflict in Transistor can be categorized mainly as person versus person and person versus society. Although fights and choices are present throughout the game, they have no impact on where the story goes and how it will finish. The main protagonist assumes the silent hero archetype, as it is quickly revealed that Red has lost her voice. She also wields a magic sword throughout the game to further the archetype. This archetype is fairly common and can be seen in other games, for example, The Legend of Zelda and Transistor. Meaningful play is arguably one of the most important elements in a game, and it emerges from the relationship between player action and system outcome. Transistor features discernible actions, which are actions that give the player immediate feedback. In Transistor, when you hit an enemy, you know you've dealt damage when you are given an audio and visual cue. Integrated actions are actions that will have an impact on the greater game. For example, destroying enemies in order to gain new functions and progressing through the story. Because of this, we can establish that the developers have indeed created a game with meaningful play. But have they created enough agency? Similar to meaningful play, agency is a player's ability to control a character in a game to make decisions that have meaningful outcomes. While the game has no agency or choices story-wise, as previously stated because the game is linear, most if not all of Transistor's agency resides in functions. Functions can be combined with any other functions in order to change their effects. While there is no incorrect combination, one choice will have a different impact on the game than another. For example, one person may outfit their functions to suit a long-range playstyle, while another may choose to focus on pets or minions. Both cases are a product of choice and agency, and will drastically change gameplay. We can now talk specifically about the player. One of the best ways to identify demographics of a game would be to create a persona for the type of person who would play Transistor. Some assumptions can be safe ones, such as the age of your audience being around teenager or young adult. Others are more difficult to assume, such as the type of personality the player has. Transistor can be played by many different types of people. Some enjoy the action-packed aspects of the game, some enjoy it for its award-winning art and design, and others enjoy it for its beautiful story. To make this process easier, we can categorize the gamers. Using Bartle's taxonomy, we can quickly identify 3 types of gamers who would play Transistor. The Achiever could play Transistor in order to beat the game on a 100% run, the Explorer could play Transistor to uncover the mysterious world and story, and the Killer could play simply just to bash some bots. To further represent how flexible Transistor is, we can look at gamer motivations and classifications. Some players can play for action, as Transistor's core gameplay is made up of fighting sequences where you fight robots. Some players play for mastery, enjoying the use of limiters in order to make the game even more challenging, or simply to come up with more optimal strategies. Some play for achievement, to build the most powerful character ever. Some are immersed in both a fantastical universe and its wonderful story. Finally, some just enjoy the creative elements that went into the game, such as its soundtrack and art design. It should be noted that this game will not be enjoyed by casual players, as it cannot be picked up and played easily, and requires you to pay full attention to its story. Supergiant Games is an indie developer based in San Francisco, California. They released their first game in 2011 titled Bastion, which was critically acclaimed and received numerous awards, springboarding their reputation. In 2014, Transistor was released, and while it was a completely different game, the same quality seen in Bastion was also present. But how was such a high-quality game achieved? Supergiant Games chose to keep all game-related matters in-house, while they were developers of their game design choices and deadlines. Additionally, they have neither sought nor accepted any outside funding, choosing to instead self-fund by reinvesting money made off of Bastion into Transistor, in order to further prevent outside influence. As for the design team, Supergiant Games consisted of 7 members during the creation of Bastion and 12 during Transistor. By keeping the team small, all choices made were easily coordinated and executed. Game engine-wise, Supergiant Games uses their own proprietary game engine, ensuring they can properly utilize their tool to the fullest. That about wraps up our critical Let's Play on Transistor. Thank you for joining us, and please enjoy our extra footage and the soundtrack as the credits scroll. Thanks.
from inside.